announcements that Dwight is at the University of Tennessee. He's had long careers, both a scholar and an administrator, and is one of the few people who's had several director and deanships and still continue to publish. I wanted to introduce him on a little bit more personal note also. Dwight was the department chair at the University of Texas Austin when I went there as an assistant professor, and it was because of Dwight that I got my first book contract. We were talking about how there was a need for a new journalism history text one day in his office, and before I knew it, the Macmillan representative was there signing us up. And because Dwight had made a move and did some other things, I ended up doing more of the work than originally planned, and unlike most senior people, Dwight said, "You've done more of the work, so you're now first author, and you get more of the royalties than were in the contract." And I think that it's rare that people have that kind of integrity and commitment to junior faculty, and so especially 10 years or so ago. And I really have always appreciated that and thought that it was a measure of his great integrity. So I welcome Dwight to Chapel Hill. He hasn't been here for a while, and look forward to hearing the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Jean. I'm going to, we're a small group, and I'm going to try to keep it informal, and I may stand up and pace around if I get nervous. Somebody like Don Shaw or Ruth Walden asked me a question that I can't deal with, which is likely. Anyway, this is, feels in some ways like coming home, because I've been so close to Jean for so many years, and that's one of the things I brag about, because I was the department head at Texas when we hired her, and that was a really smart move on my part, I thought. It had been proven in a number of other venues, including, I think, this one. Don Shaw and I have say we've known each other so long, if we owned any whiskey as old as our friendship, it would cost about $800 per bottle. Anyway, Don is an admired colleague in the Academy, and he's one of two people I know who is both a first-rate social scientist and a first-rate historian. The other one is his student, who's my sometime co-author, Edward Caudill, who has a PhD from UNC. Ruth Walden is sitting in the wrong place, because when I was at her in class as an undergraduate, and darn it, Ruth, I do remember you. Your hair was a different color then.
Oh, yeah.
So was mine.
Oh, yeah.
And anyway, she sat, I would lecture, and she would sit just in the front, just off to my left, and occasionally pin me to the blackboard with a question. But she came prepared. I wasn't always. Anyway, I appreciated that. I thought she was probably going to become an attorney, and I thought, if so, I'm going to hire her if I get in trouble. Dwight Hopkins I've known off and on for quite a few years now. Haven't gotten to spend as much time with Watt as I would like, but I admire his work as a scholar in law and as a journal editor in law. And I think, wow, I'm glad to be in the company of these people. Frank Fee is an editor, and I need all the editing I can get. So anyway, it's just really grand to be here with you, and I'm grateful. I'm so grateful that I have a rather lengthy prepared script, and the good news is I'm going to throw away 2/3 of it. Actually, 2/3 of it is manuscript that Watt says, "Would you take a look at this?" And I will, for his journal, for Watt. Yes, I will. And if I start going too long, I will truncate the presentation. I'm calling this name calling and Christian anxiety. These are two kind of different themes in the press of pre-Civil War America. And I am not as pure an historian as I should be, which could get me into trouble with either Gene Folkers or Donald Shaw, but I keep, I read this really rotten newspapering in the 1850s, the James Gordon Bennett, hysterical, racist name-calling and political defamation. And Fox News. And I think that maybe the devil had made a deal with James Gordon Bennett, and he came back in the person of Rupert Murdoch. I just wonder about that. Anyway, I'm somebody who spent quite a bit of my life working on 18th century American journalism. At the time of the American Revolution, and I was startled after some years in Tennessee to find that I had kidnapped into doing some Civil War era work, and that was just not right. All the people I knew in graduate school, other than Don Shaw, were kind of 18th century historical buffs. One of my doctoral pals we called, to say he was conservative understates it, we called him the last living Federalist. There have been some who called me the last living anti-Federalist, which I would embrace that. That's okay. So, anyway, working with mid-19th century journalism still seems to me sort of like current events. But there it is. Anyway, I've now had a hand and a part in committing two sort of Civil War era books. And anybody else in here written any books on the Civil War? There are more than 50,000 of them out there. It's sort of like cookbooks. Publishers always seem to take either cookbook or a book on the Civil War era. Anyway, why did I do this? Well, for what it's worth, it seems to me that the pre-Civil War decades in America have not received sufficient attention. Much has been written about the war and the Civil War, but there was a lot more going on before then. And most Civil War history is military history, which is drum and trumpet history. What a friend of mine from Tennessee and later Illinois got involved in was cultural and social history, which you might call bum and strumpet history. And I just felt it was something different. And so that's what we did. I'm going to talk about something on the pre-Civil War, and I keep having to remind myself, and this may show my shallowness, that I keep having to remind myself that people in America in 1858 didn't know the Civil War was coming. Am I crazy for having that idea? Because, you know, the Civil War kind of looms over everything. And yet, we didn't know war was coming in a lot of cases. You know, we didn't know Pearl Harbor was going to happen, etc. But anyway, throughout the 19th century's first half, there could have been war between North and South, but compromises kept being struck to avoid war. And there was compromises on where there could be slavery, for example. And anyway, they ran out of compromises in the 1850s. That was part of our question, is why. The hour in this case was my colleague Larry Ratner. He was a professor of history at Tennessee, and then later at the University of Illinois. And he died in 2007. He was a really close friend, and political and social historian, author of 10 or 12 books on politics and civil liberties in the United States since the 1830s. And he heard in the mid-90s that I had cancer. And so he decided to keep my mind off my trouble, said, let's do a book. And he proposed that we do a book about name-calling, really, in the 1850s press. And so that's what we did. And we called that book Fanatics and Fire Eaters, about northern fanatics that wanted to do away with slavery, that's what they were called in the South, and southern fire eaters who wanted to maintain slavery, to maintain their property, their human property. So that was our concern as we looked at that, and we found that much as in the late 20th or 21st century in the press or in today's blogs, America's series of divisive issues during the 1850s, and the press helped Americans take sides. And there was just a kind of, I guess there must have been kind of, oh hell thought, because in some ways, because when things would go wrong, you knew they were going to, people back then must have seen it coming. Things were really going wrong, and they knew there was going to be something serious to pay for it. I would use a presentist analogy. I think most of us who were of an age to be concerned about such things on 9/11/01, 9/11/2000, when the planes flew into the World Trade Center, and we found out what had happened, that at least something about what the attack was coming from. We said to ourselves, oh, civil liberties are going to be in trouble for a while. Because that's always been the response in the United States in times of war. Civil liberties get pinched down. And in the South, during the 1850s, the arguments between the regions now just sound so similar to almost be tragic. One of the words addressed with real reverence, North and South, the Republic, the American Republic. But then the words were the same. The Southerners wanted to protect the American Republic. The Northerners wanted to protect the American Republic. But they meant different things by it. Abraham Lincoln had declared that slavery was the only substantial dispute bringing about that conflict. And the people of the United States were fighting about slavery in a way with words, saying that if you try to do away with slavery, if you try to take away our property, you were denying something that was provided for in the Constitution of the United States, which did indeed allow the continuation of slavery. And on the other hand, in the North, the word was, how can a nation founded on freedom have slavery? And both were accusing the other. You're destroying the republic. And so, in a while, the debate over the culture of slavery and the preservation of the republic merged. And the idea of unity eroded as issues arose and were magnified in the newspaper press. The newspapers were peppered with epithets: cowardly, barbarians, traitors, sneaks, mean-spirited, unprincipled, conspiratorial. You can see these newspapers north, newspapers south. Southerners believed that the abolitionists with whom they equated Republicans would end slavery everywhere, despite Abraham Lincoln's claims while running for election that he did not intend to end slavery. Southerners saw the submerging of slavery and the submerging of Southern interests. On the other hand, readers of Northern newspapers encountered images time and again that portrayed the Southerners as dishonorable conspirators, bullies, and kind of talked about them as abstractions. And both sides were determined to live up to their revolutionary heritage. But both North and South identified their regions as summing up the ideal of the true republic and were convinced the other region was the enemy of that republic. So, fanatics and fire eaters indeed. Commentary North and South was a form of hate speech. It was, the Northerners hated Southerners, Southerners hated Northerners. And then when one of these divisive events occurred, like the caning of Senator Charles Sumner as he sat at his desk on the Senate floor during a recess in proceedings, and he was caned by Brooks, a Republican, right, a South, they were saying that all these Northerners are just fanatics. Southern newspapers were responding that Representative Preston Brooks was a hero and a gentleman, responding to attacks on Southern honor in Sumner's anti-slavery diatribes on the Senate floor. And in Georgia, the Milledgeville Federal Union denounced Senator Sumner's anti-South Carolina speeches, declaring that the speeches threatened the Union far more than the whipping. Greenville, South Carolina patriot and mountaineer referred to the genteel caning and said, "Well done, Colonel Brooks." Other events led to more furious sectional vituperation. The caning incident was soon followed by the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court never really got the decision out in a timely fashion. That was the decision that declared that Dred Scott, a slave who was claiming to become a free man by being taken by his owners into a free territory, that he didn't have standing to sue because as a slave he was not a human being. And you know, that, talk about a divisive event. The court majority, with the, I think probably borderline, he was dying. I think probably borderline mental health. Justice Tawney thought that the Dred Scott decision, we'll declare the law. This will settle the issue. And slavery means that the laws enforcing slavery are in effect, and any laws in the North that might abrogate slavery are null and void. Anyway, that was a foolhardy thought because they thought they'd put the issue to rest. The political parties would not submerge the issue of slavery as had been done in the time of Andrew Jackson. Anyway, this was a strange time because Southern newspapers reacted to the Dred Scott decision, inverted the law and order argument of Northerners against the caning of Senator Sumner. Now, with the Supreme Court decision upholding slavery, Southerners are calling for obedience to the law. Thurlow Weed of Albany, New York Evening Journal denounced the Dred Scott decision as a nearly completed conspiracy, saying the legislation of the Republic is now in the hands of a handful of slaveholders. Actually, there were 347,000 slaveholders at the time. There were other events that came up, one of which was John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in the fall of 1859. And that, of course, caused all kinds of pyrotechnical language in the newspapers, with North denouncing the South and South denouncing North. Lincoln's election in the fall of 1860 was, I guess, the final straw. And then after that, the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the secession Southern states, and as historian Edward Ayres has asserted, newspapers of the 1850s nurtured anticipation and grievance. And without the papers, he said, I'm not sure I'll go this far, but he said it, I'll put it in. Without the papers, many events we now see as decisive would have passed without wide consequence. So, the maturing communication revolution in the 1850s was a real force in American national life. The press went from cottage industry to really mass communication industry. And during that time, the effects on American life from the press were absolutely remarkable. And you think about the developments, the telegraph made possible getting coverage Express riders to get messages from Mexico to the southern terminus of the telegraph in New Orleans. And then from there, the news would come to his newspaper in New York, the New York Herald, and it was very costly to use the telegraph. So this led to the rise of cooperative news gathering. There were several organizations formed, and you've written some about this, Don. The Associated Press came out of this period with acting as middlemen, disseminating what the newspapers learned to other member newspapers of the Associated Press via the telegraph. Newspapers hungered for news, led newspapers to invest in faster steam-powered printing presses, and mass publication allowed for the rise of mass advertising, so that by the 1850s, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald said, "I'm independent of government. I don't need government. I don't need political parties anymore." This independence, which was growing in the 1850s for the newspapers, encouraged newspapers to do whatever they could to make money. And in the first decade of the 20th century, it seems like communication industries are doing the same thing. In the 1850s, newspapers boomed. The number of newspapers doubled to 387. I think the circulation doubled in that same decade to 1.5 million. It's just an astonishing rise in this number of newspapers and the size of their circulation. Much of that circulation growth came from urban papers, and I think about 60% of the total daily newspaper circulation came out of urban areas. One partial explanation for this may be that the rapidly expanding middle class was to be found made up of people whose reasons for reading were middle class reasons, ranging from pleasurable activity to business necessity. So newspapers multiplied, so did magazines. From 1850 to 1860, the number of magazines in the United States nearly tripled. Of course, they came and went, but the dollar value of the printing industry increased about threefold in the 1850s, up to 31 million annually. And although magazines often had short lives, 1850 saw Harper's begin publication, and Godey's Lady's Book was founded in 1835, and these were the two circulation leaders during the 1850s. They were just remarkable establishments. The issue of slavery, however it was discussed in print, fanned the flames of controversy and was sure to infuriate many readers. So Harper's would talk about it some. Godey's Lady's Book tended not to. Godey's Lady's Book was a manual for women how to be a middle-class housewife. And their circulations, I think by 1860, were in the order of 150,000 each. So all this publishing activity was then also seen in a great rise in book publication. And all of these things came together to have true mass media industries, I think, for the first time. Historian John Hyam saw Americans seizing boundless opportunities, yet adrift without a system of tradition and order to comfort them. And during a religious upsurge known as the Awakening of 1857-1858, noon gatherings of businessmen in New York's largest churches were confronted with concerns about too much success, too much financial speculation, and too little concerns for families and for Republican hard work, small R Republican. Religious ideology was important, but these evangelical meetings had linkages between evangelical revivalist culture and an expanding market economy. and these linkages included better communication and urban-grown industrialization. So, to shift away from the name-calling and the growth of the media, let's look at the concern over America being too rich, too irresponsible, not charitable enough. And this was a major theme in the press of the 1850s America. Towering over the northern of the newspaper scene nationally, really, was the decent but eccentric Horace Greeley and his New York Tribune. And then there was the rascally publishing innovator and raging racist James Gordon Bennett with his New York Herald, who kind of took the southern position on a lot of things during the 1850s. And these newspapers were widely circulated. They became more or less national newspapers. Bennett had a circulation of 100,000 in New York City in 1858, and by 1860 the weekly edition of Greeley's Tribune, which went all over the country, reached 200,000, which is making the most widely circulated newspaper in the world at that time. Now, there was this concern over what my co-author Larry Ratner and I, co-author who joined me after Larry's death, Mr. Ratner's wife, Paula Kaufman. We called this the prosperity morality paradox. And we can find it in newspapers. We can find it in Cincinnati Enquirer. We can find it in the Richmond Enquirer, a southern newspaper with a similar name but different ownership. Concerns over righteous behavior versus money seeking led the Richmond Enquirer to put some of its regional emphasis on the issue. The editors of the Richmond paper warned readings against Northern socialism, Western land speculation, and promoting stupendous frauds. The Cincinnati Enquirer took up concerns of social stability and morality, urging its readers to develop skills needed for business success and the virtues to uphold Christian and family values. And by that they also meant Republican values. Professor Ratner and I also read circulation leading magazines. Harper's, of course, and Godey's were two of them. We read some other ones, business magazines and some southern magazines. Harper's was talking about greed threatening the republic, stripping virtue from the characters of public men. And Harper's praised women who supported, but did not challenge men. They should support their husbands, but don't correct them too much. Also expressed approval of women who succeeded in appropriate areas of endeavor. Jenny Lind, the singer, was okay because she gave some of her money to charity. But English nurse Florence Nightingale, now that was a selfless woman. That was fine. But on the other hand, Margaret Fuller, a Soley. Margaret Fuller was a book reviewer and sub-editor for Horace Greeley's Tribune. But she was also getting beyond what a woman should do by publishing Dial magazine. And when Margaret Fuller, O'Soley, and I guess she's too much forgotten, she was a remarkable intellect and a remarkable social critic. And she died in a shipwreck. And when she died, Harper's Magazine, which in the theme of women should not get above their station, even, I think, sort of implied that what happened to Margaret Soley happened, she drowned in a shipwreck because she did not know her place. So women were competing against make their way in the world. Godey's Ladies book was edited by Sarah Hale, and she was no feminist in some ways. In other ways, she was. She was very cautious. I guess there's an I guess always a line somewhere on what is permissible expression. And Sarah Hale saw the tensions between home and marketplace, but talked about how women should support their husbands and have a good Christian family. But she also, in subtle ways, pushed for expansion of women's roles. And in her Godey's Ladies book that she edited, owned by publisher Lewis Godey, she urged that women be given higher education with curricula similar to men, and she pleaded with readers to understand the plight of widows struggling to support themselves and their children, and urged, and this sounds positively medieval, that she would have to urge this, that women should be able to inherit their husband's money and property so that they wouldn't have to remarry to be able to survive. That was pretty radical stuff. I mean, she was not calling for the vote for women, but she was taking an important stand. Now, Godey's was concerned about the tensions between home and marketplace, as was Harper's. But the real, I think, breakthrough for women came with the boom in book publishing. The Godey's Ladies book linked women to the emerging industrial ethic of productivity and efficiency, and Sarah Hale was telling women how to run a more effective household, how to make the husband more effective, and also espoused Jeffersonian values, praising rural rather than urban life. Now, as Americans read more and more printed material, quite a number of them decided that they could be authors too. Poetry, fiction, nonfiction pieces were submitted to newspapers, magazines, and book publishers. Yet the odds were against authors, but some of this mix of 1850s optimism and desperation mixed together and kept writers writing. Take the example of Susan Warner. She had submitted a manuscript about family life, and she submitted it to Harper, book publishers as well as magazine publishers. Harper turned the magazine down, and a hard-boiled editor at Harper's turned the manuscript down with a single comment written across it. Don't do this one. He wrote across it, fudge. And anyway, she, if you're an author, you try again. And she tried George Putnam's publishing house. And Putnam looked at this manuscript and didn't want it. And he thought, well, maybe my mother, who lives with me, could be interested in it. So he took it home. And this manuscript just reduced Mrs. Putnam to tears. It was so sentimental, so sweet, it was so wonderful. She told her son to publish this book if he never published another. And he did. The book was called Wide, Wide World. And today it's just dreadful to read. It is, contrived, it's over-sugary in its sentimentality, but it sold more than 500,000 copies. And that was 1/30 of the total, well, more than one, I'd say 1/20 maybe the total book publishing output in the United States in that generation. Mammoth bestseller. And also had huge sales in England. And the book sales figures in the first 2 years, at a time when if you made $50 a year, you were probably pretty well fixed. The book sales over the first 2 years added to up to $750,000. And so this is just remarkable breakthrough publication. publication by a woman artist and a woman author. And these, as I said, these books published then, the bestsellers, were not, for the most part, literary masterpieces, but the writers that we read today, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, they sold well, but not as well as the women writers. Women were readers too, and I think publishers finally wised up to that. Henry David Thoreau's Walden was published in 1854. Wasn't really popular at all before the Civil War. So there was, after 1850, there was a form of democratization as a number of writers emerged who could find wealth by writing, and many others counted on writing for at least a modest income. Let me give you a couple of other examples of successful women writers. Women overcame social pressures, as I said, and really discouraging odds in a male-dominated society to rise in the world of authorship. They wrote for profit, but they also, this is the way they could, without a vote, they could have a voice in discussing the ills of society. And they were educated or self-educated, and they often, out of desperation, plunged into the marketplace trying to publish something. Beneath many a woman's pseudonym, a couple of authors have written, Ronald Zaborre and his wife Mary have written in their literary dollars book that beneath many a woman's pseudonym lay tales of broken vows or deceased spouses. And two of the most successful of the women writers during the 1850s were Susan Warner, mentioned earlier for her Wide, Wide World, and then, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, read today, is kind of puzzling, kind of disheartening. It was really about the clash of Christian values with marketplace ideas, written by a woman who had never been really exposed to slavery. She lived across the river from Cincinnati for a time. But she was the daughter of a prominent congregational minister and temperance movement leader, Lyman Beecher. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she published Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think she's published it in serial form, and then it was finally published by one book publisher, turned it down because he was afraid of the market in the South. John Jewett of Boston published it, thought it would be a short novel, but he did publish it. It wasn't that short. And in just over 5 years, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book had sold 500,000 copies. It sold millions in the United States and more than 1 million in England by 1880. Stowe's book used slavery as a prime example of the evils of materialism and suggested women could play roles in the fight against human bondage. And her target was the moral paradox Americans encountered because of their headlong pursuit of riches at the expense of Christian values. And the men in Harriet Beecher Stowe's family had a pulpit for an outlet. They were prominent ministers. But she had paper and pen, and she made a lot out of it. Stowe's book, as you read it today, has really what I think we might, in our culture, would think of serious racist overtones, like sending the blacks back to Africa, when most all of them, by 1850, were born here in the United States. Anyway, also, got to send them back to Africa because the Africans cannot deal with the marketplace. That they are not ready. They're curious people, and they're not ready for our civilized life, in effect. So these women authors were so successful that their book publishers made serious money out of them, from them, And at one point, Nathaniel Hawthorne, he wrote the Scarlet Letter, and serious author. And in his correspondence, he was to other writers, he was complaining about these scribbling women who were out selling around 20 to 1. So this upsurge in Christian concern, Christian anxiety, I think was kind of a door that opened for women to allow them to get into the literary marketplace. I would like also to just, before I conclude here, suggest a couple of lines of research. And one of the things that fascinated me in the newspapers of the 1850s was the newspaper's fascination with the Mormons and their polygamous ways and so on, and how they'd struggled and made their way, their bloody way at some time, to Utah to establish the state of Deseret. And then second, and I think that there's probably a book here, there's a, and I imagine that there are historians that are working on, I know, on Mormon pilgrimage west and all that. And I'm sure they'll pick up the newspaper coverage. One of the things that I see, or I saw in those papers, was a lot of concern about train wrecks and steamships blowing up. And they tied this to the craziness over material gain. One steamship is racing another and blows up. They overtaxed the boilers. And they killed all these people just trying to outcompete each other. That's not Christian. And then that was a time they were beginning to write about all these accidents, all these people killed on railroads. And one of the really pernicious legal doctrines in America was something called the fellow servant rule back in the late 19th century. That is, if somebody is working on a railroad and a railroad worker's error caused a fellow worker to lose an arm, the fellow servant rule meant that the injured man had the right to sue his fellow worker. Couldn't sue the railroad. That's justice in that time. This led to, I think there's a newspaper and magazine background for the eventual passage of workmen's compensation in America. Workmen's compensation got started in Wisconsin in the 1890s and under the progressives. I think, I really think that this is a number of newspaper editors were glad to see the Civil War. Horace Greeley said that the war would bring a national regeneration. James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald said that the war would improve the American character, adding, without war, a society would become steeped in luxury and effeminacy. And Bennett even claimed the chief cause of the war was prosperity, excessive prosperity. After the Civil War, as far as we could see, Americans became tired of wrestling with the guilt and the ambiguity, struggling with that prosperity morality paradox. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a major voice, at least in the North, for America's growing middle class, urged Americans to embrace their bright future. He told his readers and listeners after the Civil War to love themselves and the nation, and in effect to get rid of the prosperity morality paradox. So I think the middle class did that. So, anyway, that's a couple of things I've learned for reading old newspapers. And any questions or comments?
I do have a question. I'm curious about your sources for circulation figures you cited in the 19th century.
Well, there wasn't an audit bureau of circulation. And I don't know how inflated they were. I guess I'm giving the claims, really claimed that his New York Tribune had rose to a weekly circulation of 200,000, and it was shipped all over the country. And Bennett was triumphantly saying, I've reached 100,000 with my daily. And he also had a weekly edition that went out broadly. I don't think it was successful. It's the weekly edition of Forest Freedom.
Do you remember when verified figures begin? Is it before the 20s, or when they're published before that in editor and publisher index?
We had errors and Rowells, which were industry circulation for advertisers, and they claims, but they were not documented. ABC is the year 2070.
That's what I was thinking, the 1920s about.
Even earlier than that.
Is it?
Was that the Rowell advertising agency that started some of the early work on circulation verification?
They weren't verified. Yeah, they weren't verified.
They were very verified. It's just what the publishers claim.
You know, if I had
anybody know when the ABC starts? When there's an advertiser's verified version? Interesting to find out.
Yeah, if Larry Ratner had lived, I think that I might have argued that we back up a little bit, because I thought and maybe it's just my own naivete or lack of knowledge, but I thought that what I was most taken with was women entering the literary marketplace, because that was a major theme. And I know of one person that's worked on it some. That's Jenny McBride at Wisconsin PhD. You may know from, she's at Wisconsin Milwaukee. It was the last time I heard of her. But anyway, when Susan Warner was selling 500,000 copies, and Nathaniel Hawthorne was selling 20,000 copies, you can see the tension generated there. Scribbling women. Yes.
On that point, I was wondering, I didn't quite catch, what was the date that the Wild book was published?
1852, I think.
Okay, so I was wondering where Louisa May Alcott fit in this, because that was her era, correct?
I'm sorry?
Louisa May Alcott was publishing at this period as well.
She was not one that we looked at.
Mm-hmm.
Probably should have. I think
1854 was her. No, 1854 I believe was her first
was
book.
it?
Yes.
Well, that was one we missed.
Mm-hmm.
We probably should have gone after.
Did she become popular at that point?
I don't know. I just know that was, I think that was in 1852 or 1854 she began publishing, and I don't know if that, I don't really know enough about, I mean, I haven't studied it. It's fascinating that you mention it, but
anyway, I think that might be something that I don't think there'll ever be another edition of that book. But,
the other question I had was about you flicked at the idea of looking at business magazines, and I was intrigued by also by this concept of greed that you saw being referenced in the newspapers, because that's so resonant with today. Could I suspect, were the business magazines talking about greed as well, or probably not?
Were there business
The
magazines?
business magazines were warning against speculation.
They were,
And
unlike today.
Yes.
What are the names? Do you recall the names of any of these magazines? That you...
I think there was one of them had a really long and involved title, if I can come up with it here.
So obviously not Business Week.
They did not survive. It was something like the Journal of Southern and Western Business, published out of New Orleans by conservative Democrats.
Are you thinking of DeVoe's Review?
The DeVoe's Review was the big one.
That's right. They did carry.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we did look at DeVoe's Review. My co-author did. I did not adequately, obviously. But anyway, DeVoe, these were not big circulation magazines. They weren't like Harper's or Goody's, but they were important. And we tried to find kind of the leading magazines in various categories, whether it's business or the women's publication, or Harper's was easy because it was it's kind of a standout
publishing success. And then there were other, a lot of books, various kinds of books. History books that like George Bancroft, kind of triumphalist American history. We're the greatest nation ever, the greatest society ever. And then Bancroft would feed ideas out such as these wonderful, I didn't say that, but that's what he meant, wonderful Europeans came to this country and displaced the Indians, but that was all right because the Indians were just kind of a vagrant race. They didn't do anything to improve the land, and so it was okay to take it from them. And then Bancroft's history also comparing George Washington favorably over any 1850s political leaders. I think that was a frequent theme in histories of the day. Emma Willard's was another one that went that general direction. There was a lot of travel books like Bayard Taylor, who came, I think, off of Greeley's Tribune to become a really successful travel writer. But again, they always came in with some sort of the Christian society is better than this society. And,
Is it possible to separate your arguments about Christian assertions from women? Or do they go together?
separate the.
In other words, we need to do better, we need to do good. It has to be associated in some feminist literature with women. But I'm just thinking, they must have been thinking a lot about it right before the Civil War,
Well,
about slavery and so forth.
I think they really, if I followed your question, I think they really had logic-type compartments about, men were worrying about, are we being charitable enough? This was being pushed by evangelists leading the awakening of 1857, 1858. And the fact that women were treated as less than, so much less than men, that never seemed to bother anybody. It bothered the women, but not the men.
You wonder if there's a sort of cultural theme that goes through. It'd be interesting to test it in different time periods about this sort of, we're the best, we strive to achieve, sort of American culture is triumphant against the sort of guilt, we're too greedy, that balance, because you see that kind of now. I mean, as you said, it's sort of resonant with today, but it's almost a cultural dilemma that gets played out, and you wonder if there are economic high times that's always played out, and then it goes away during depressions or not. I mean, it'd just be interesting to see how that cultural argument plays out, I think, in different time periods.
Yeah, I think a lot of that just got overwhelmed after the Civil War. There was a great burst of economic development, and people just stopped worrying, I think, about such
Sort of like
concerns.
1950s.
But it's in good times. The good times will never end. We've lived through that recently, haven't we? They ended in 2008 pretty badly. Yes, sir.
Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind. I'm very interested in the mid-19th century American.
Oh, good.
I've played with this idea, but I decided I'm not going to chase the white rabbit down the hole at this point because I have a dissertation to finish. But it seems
good plan.
It seems to me that with the circulation claims of the New York Tribune and the New York Herald, if we don't have verified numbers for the time, it might be possible if we get a clear enough understanding of what the press capacities were and what the average number of pages they produced for an edition, to get some idea of whether the claims were even plausible.
Well, I think there is some of that about the presses being bought in the 1850s and what the capacity was per hour and how long the press runs would be.
Right.
And so I think there's a certain amount, you can get pretty close to verification on that. And then there's another thing that it wasn't just Greeley's Tribune or his Weekly Tribune. There were all these other smaller dailies and weeklies out there with editors with scissors and paste pots. And so a lot of this, if they agreed with Greeley, they put it in their paper. If they disagreed with Bennett, they put it in their paper and comment on it. So this, there's a great outpouring, outreach from New York.
They're like bloggers, weren't they?
Yes. Well, somebody's written that's a good point. Somebody's written a book on the Telegraph, called it the Victorian Internet. It's kind of a neat title.
Right. Are there any business records of the, like Tribune or Herald? Do you know? Are there any business records in archives?
There are two possible places to look on the Tribune that I can think of. One of them is there is a business manager for the New York Tribune whose papers are either part of the New York Public Library Archives or the Butler Library Archives at Columbia University.
His name escapes me right now, but he really ran that newspaper a lot longer than Uncle Horace, who was over in Europe or wherever.
Right.
Yeah, he was a remarkable figure in American journalism. Wasn't the front man, but really important.
The other possible place, this is actually available at North Carolina State University's libraries, but Horace Greeley left behind an enormous number of papers, and those are available on microfilm, 37 rolls of microfilm. You'd have to do a lot of sifting and finding, but
And Greeley had the world's worst handwriting, I understand.
Horrendous.
Well, you
Horrendous.
should start all your history exploration after 1880.
Yeah. The other thing I wondered about is you were mentioning the development of a truly mass press, a truly mass medium. And I wonder what you might have seen in your research of evidence of a chain of production in which reporters wrote serial letters to their newspapers, and then those were transformed into books. Because in my work, I've the dissertation, I look at 8 different journalists.
Mm-hmm.
7 of them had serialized, letters turned into books. And I wonder if that is an overlooked corner of journalism history that was just a lot more prevalent than I have ever seen.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. An awful lot of things have started in serial form, and then Uncle Tom's Cabin started as a serial for a newspaper, I think, out of Washington, D.C., I believe, or Maryland.
National Herald.
Pardon?
National Era, that's right.
National Herald.
National Era, yeah. And yet it was, she was still, because of reader demand, she was still producing installments in her serial, while her publisher was howling for, bring it to an end, bring it to an
I
end.
don't think she had written, I think she just wrote as she went along. I don't think she
Yeah,
finished.
I think that's right.
And then finally,
She had to be taught to finish.
the publisher pretty much published it, just a week or 2 after the last installment.
What type of books did these journalists put together? I mean, what are some of the titles? Are they just-
Well, I was looking specifically at travel books, but you mentioned Mayor Taylor.
Yeah.
His MO was he would go off to Norway or Northern Africa or California during the Constitutional Convention there in 1849.
And then George William Curtis, who was for a while editor of Harper's, you can find his byline in the editor's easy chair.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds very current.
Yeah, but there would be these enormous strings of travel letters. There would sometimes be 50 serialized letters, and then get turned into books. El Dorado was one example of Mayor Taylor. Another example was there was another writer named W.W.H. Davis who wrote one fellow called El Gringo, or New Mexico and Her People, which was also printed by Harper's. So those are just a couple. Some of them came out as subscription books too. Now the versions are published with American Publishing, later published Mark Twain.
Are the travel books a reflection of increased income and people's ability to travel? Or are they a reflection of curiosity and people wanting to know about other parts of the world but not necessarily traveling?
I would say curiosity more than anything else. I mean, the way that it appears to me is that these were correspondents who were sent by their newspapers to unknown parts of the world because there was a good buck to be had in selling information about that and in just figuring out whether any of the information that was coming out of these lesser known areas was even true. That's why Greeley sent Barry Taylor off to California. He wanted someone that he could trust that wasn't aligned with the government or some speculation company, or something else like that.
So it was really news coverage in that sense.
It really was.
If the women's magazines weren't talking explicitly about slavery or issues regarding slavery and war, were there more subtle ways or implicit ways those topics showed up?
Well, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, met the thing head on in her way. I think one of the themes, of course, was temperance, because Papa's coming home drunk, and after he spent the paycheck or spent the wages, I think one of the, as I mentioned her name, Jenny McBride has done some, I think, really good work on women's clubs of the 19th century. And I think then some of the suffragist movements kind of come sort of bubbling up through this too. But I didn't find much along the way, women like God need to vote, must have to vote. It was, as in Godey's Ladies book, there's some things that were needed, like being able to, for a woman to inherit a husband's property. And that would have been or women, if they could do that, they wouldn't have to remarry just to stay alive. And, it wasn't the submerged state of women, and there were some major battles later in the 19th century over after the Civil War on women who, especially notably black women, like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who fought against lynch mobs, wrote about lynch mobs, got driven out of Memphis, moved to New York where it was safer, and she got crosswise with the women's movement because she had her concerns as a black woman, and the other parts of the women's movement just didn't get it. And so there was, Ida B. Wells was not happy with them, or she was more popular, I think, more of a force in England toward the end of her life than she was in the United States. Yes?
I had two comments. One, I was wondering if a major theme would be property, writings about property. Following?
She's asking if one of the major themes was writing about property.
Property?
Property.
Because slavery
slavery
was
and
seen as
slavery.
property. And then you talk about how women, one of the concerns was,
Property or poverty?
Property.
Property.
You seem like there's the conversation about slavery as property.
Yeah,
And then the
I
conversation
think
about-
that was seen as a violation but in the North, it's a violation of Christian values. You should not own another human being.
But then there's this other conversation about women and being able to keep their property or inherit property. So is there a theme of property that goes through all of this or not?
I can't really make that jump.
Okay.
Maybe it's there, I just don't make that jump.
and my other question is about the ethnic press, the African American press, or
Uh-huh.
the Spanish language press.
There were some early efforts on the African American press. I'd have to go back and consult my book on that with you to give me some names of African American editors.
Well, they start as early as the 1820s, there's an African American press, but whether they're involved in, Frank would know better. Is Frank still here? He had to leave, I know. But the focus is pretty solely, and Barbara, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's not, but the focus is pretty solely on ending slavery, getting the right to vote, pretty political in that sense. And I would guess, although I'm not sure, Lucila, there's not much discussion of women or women's rights. Although Frederick Douglass is tied up with the women's movement, so there's some intertwining of the African American rights movement and the women's movement, but they clash at different times also because of some people supporting one movement and not the other. So they come together and they go apart at different times. But I can't give you a very good timeline on it.
Women were quite active in the early days of the Liberty Party and so forth, door-to-door work for anti-slavery.
Anti-slavery. And the American Bible Society had a lot of women.
It's almost as if they learned from their arguments, and the Senator Fall, and thereafter women were getting that way. If you could ever find that parallel you're talking about, where you go across and look at property in those two senses, and they're related, you'll become a famous historian.
Okay, I'm going to try very hard.
Yeah, it's an intriguing idea, I think.
Yes.
It really is. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and appreciate Barbara's time. Thanks to Sri for the Colloquium series. Sri's really put together a great series this year. And we have one more Colloquium before the end of the year.